Now we're going to model the alignment method used in POW instruction. So what we're really doing is classifying NAEP release items to the state standards. For the ELA section of POW, we're working with passages as well as items. In the passage section, determine what the purpose of the passage is. What is the text structure? What are the language features of the passage? What are the knowledge demands of the passage? With a provided Lexile measure, determine if the text is appropriate for the intended grade. For your qualitative judgments, mention any considerations that should be taken if including this passage in your instruction. Lastly, determine the overall text complexity for this passage. When going through the items that belong to each of the passages, while making item classification judgments, first determine what grade is most appropriate for the item. Next, determine what Montana Common Core strand is most appropriate for the item. If you have a K5 appropriate item, determine what foundational skill is being met. Now indicate the college and career ready standard that is addressed by this item. Signify the standard that is being met. Determine the language features of the prompt. Lastly, determine the rigor of the item. This includes Norman Webb's depth of knowledge and the revised Bloom's taxonomy for the item. When filling out your consensus building sheet, you will note the fitness to each of your judgments. The item fitness scale used for POW instruction is as follows. It is a 0 to 3 scale, 3 being an excellent fit, 2 being a good fit, 1 being a weak fit, and 0 describing no fit. For an excellent fit, this means that the concepts and skills addressed in the Common Core standards are also included in the NAEP item expectations in both verb, performance, and content topic are equivalent. If the specificity is different, but the content and the performance expectations are similar, or if a NAEP item's expectations went beyond the expectations of the Common Core standards, a rating of a 3 would be given. For a good fit, this means part of the compound NAEP item expectations applies to the Common Core standard and part does not, or minor aspects of the standards are missing, or address more broadly or generally than in the Common Core standards. The Common Core standards may use a different verb than the NAEP item expectations, but if the content is similar, this could be rated a 2. For a weak fit, this means that major aspects of the Common Core are not addressed. The content may be related, but only generally. A rating of a 1 might indicate a skill that is a building block to the Common Core. Finally, a 0, no fit, means no aspects of the Common Core are addressed with the NAEP item. Please note, if the Common Core is compound and the NAEP item expectation only addresses one of the expectations, the NAEP standard would get a rating of a 1 or a 2. For this modeling exercise, we will be looking at the alien home passage and the items that correspond to the alien home passage. We will also use Karen Hess's tools for examining text complexity. This informational text rubric will be used to determine whether or not this is a simple text, somewhat complex text, or a very complex text. From these classifications of the complexity of the text, we have a breakdown of the passage layout, the purpose and the meaning of the passage, the structure and the discourse, the language features, and the background knowledge demands that the passage may have. Before we transfer our knowledge to the text complexity decision, it may be useful to use this planning worksheet. This planning worksheet allows us to have more space to jot out the characteristics of the text and to identify the most appropriate standards for this assessment passage. So here we can see the factors that influence our text complexity decision, our rubric ratings. So is this a very simple passage to a very complex passage? The characteristics we should take into account for this passage and where it's most appropriate to the Montana Common Core standards. In reviewing the alien and home passage, you might have answers such as these. For the alien invasion and the home on the range passage, the Common Core suggested Lexile range for this grade level is 955 to 1155. The alien invasion Lexile measure is 1070 versus the home of the range, which is 1130. Based on this measurement, the Lexile measures for these passages are within the expected Lexile range. Going through and using the descriptions found on that rubric, we see that most of the ratings for this passage are somewhat complex. Here are some notes about the characteristics we should mention for this text. So based on our planning sheet, we would use the information contained in the planning sheet to fill in our text complexity analysis for this passage. In going through, we see that this text is accessible and the quantitative and qualitative aspects of these texts are appropriate for the expected grade level. Some domain-specific words may elicit students to have prior background knowledge on the subject. The text shows some bias for little human management of species by the case studies reference. The discussion of the introduction of the non-native species could present or lead to sensitivity issues of why species are facing extinction. These passages also have caption photos. They show Tier 2 and Tier 3 words. And in order to understand the content of the passages, some science is needed to understand what the introduction of species is, what extinction is, and what human management is. Overall, the text complexity measure for alien invasion and the home on the range passage is a 2. They are somewhat complex. Now we will look at an item that corresponds to the alien home NAEP passage. The question, what is the central purpose of the alien invasion? So what grade is most appropriate for this item? The grade that is most appropriate item is an 8. The Lexile range supports this placement. The strand that is most appropriate for this item is informational text. The college and career standard being addressed with this item is key ideas and details. Students should read closely to determine what the text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. What standard is being met by this item? This would be informational grade 8, standard 1, placement. They should cite the textual evidence that most strongly supports an analysis of what the text says explicitly as well as inferences drawn from the text. The language features of this prompt is not applicable because this prompt is not a vocabulary question. The depth of knowledge for this item is level 2. They need to locate information from the passage to support explicit or implicit central ideas. The revised Bloom's taxonomy for this item is understand. Students need to explain what evidence supports their argument. The passage here, using what you read in the alien invasion, explain why people should be concerned about invasive species. For this item, the grade that is most appropriate is grade 8. The Lexile range supports this placement. The strand that is most appropriate for this item would be in writing, because this is a constructed response item, and in order to proficiently respond to this question, students need to demonstrate their writing skills and abilities. The college and career ready standard being addressed for this item is research to build and present knowledge, drawing evidence from the informational text to support their reflection. The standard being met for this item is writing grade 8, 9b. Apply the grade 8 reading standard to a literary nonfiction passage. The language feature of this prompt is not applicable because it is not a vocabulary item. The depth of knowledge for this item is a level 2. Students need to locate information from the passage to support explicit or implicit central ideas. The revised Bloom's taxonomy for this item is understand. Students need to explain what evidence supports people's concern for invasive species. For our POW purposes, focus your attention on one primary standard. Don't forget to include the scoring guide in your decisions. If the item has more than one part, classify the most significant part of the item. In alignment, we want the smallest grain size possible. However, there may be instances that secondary standards should be considered for full alignment. In these cases, reference the secondary standards and in the comments section, make sure to denote which is your primary placement and why it is your primary placement. Due to our POW scope and time restrictions, we will mainly model and gain agreement on primary standard designations. That being said, conversations about why there are multiple parts of an item or why one item may address several common core standards should take place. For instance, these conversations can take place while clarifying points of disagreement between you and your peers in your consensus rounds. It is important to know what these differences are and why they are prevalent. These fruitful conversations about constructs, assessment designs, and the assessment purposes may reveal nuances that everyone should bear in mind while considering their classification decisions. These considerations will help you become more assessment literate and understand why the NAEP construct by design was not intended to conform to the expectations of the Montana Common Core standards. The third and final example for the alien home passage. In the question, in Alien Invasion on page 4, an Australian official says, "We cannot tolerate a situation where cane toads are traveling across the Australian continent. This means that the official thinks that Australians cannot." The grade most appropriate for this item, again, would be a grade 8, where the Lexile range supports the placement. The strand that is most appropriate would be reading informational text and language conventions. The college and career ready standard being addressed for this item is craft or structure and vocabulary acquisition and use. Students need to interpret words and phrases as they are used in the text, including determining technical, connotative, and figurative meanings, and analyze specific word choices, shape, meaning, or tone. They need to determine or clarify the meaning of unknown and multi-meaning words and phrases by using context clues, analyzing meaningful word parts, and consulting general and specialized reference materials as appropriate. The standard being met with this item, this would be an informational grade 8, number 4 standard, and language grade 8, 4A standard. Students need to determine the meaning of words and phrases as they are used in the text, including figurative, connotative, and technical meanings. Analyze the impact of specific word choices on meaning and tone, including analogies and allusions to other texts. They need to use context as a clue to the meaning of a word or phrase. And the language features of this prompt are academic vocabulary words, so it is a tier 2 word. The depth of knowledge for this item is a level 1. Students need to recall, that is, read words orally in connected text with fluency and accuracy. And for revised Bloom's taxonomy, it would be remember. They need to recognize or locate a word. Now that we have gone through all the aspects of the ELA standards and protocols needed to consider when making item classification judgments, the POW assignments are to read passages and to work the items of the passages. When reading a passage, use the planning worksheet and the text complexity rubric to brainstorm the 8 factors of text complexity. Make note of what subjects are applicable for the passage. What kind of structure, language demand, and required content knowledge does the passage require? Use qualitative and quantitative measures of the text to determine how complex the text is. After working out the nuances of the passage, populate the text complexity analysis sheet for a group discussion of the passage and its overall text complexity. For items, work the items belonging to the passage. Work these items as if you were a student. Make notes while you work the problem of the steps you took in order to complete the task. Use these notes in the comment section of your consensus building sheet to articulate the knowledge, skills, and abilities, for instance the verbs, a student would need to successfully answer this question. Place the item where it best is represented under the Montana Common Core standards, for instance, informational grade 6, standard 2. Elicit any evidence of the standard that helped you place this item in the evidence section of your consensus building sheet.